So welcome back. Hopefully you took a minute to take a look at all of these angle pairs right here and try to identify what they are. So let's go ahead and jump on in. So on this first one, I'm talking about this angle right here, angle DAC, and then this other angle right here, angle CAB. Now, they do share a side, so they are adjacent. So if you put that, awesome. But they're also another word because I noticed this box right here. So that box means 90. It's not a right angle though because it's 2 and they would add up to 90 if you look at the edges. So if this was 40, this other one would have to be 50. So they're adjacent and complementary. Which leads us to the next one. If I take a look at these two angles, I don't know what they add up to, but I do know that the edge is not a straight line. So I could do process of elimination here. I know that they don't make a linear pair. They're not supplementary. They're not making an L, so they're not complementary. They're not vertical. Therefore, the only word to describe these two angles is adjacent. Now, on this next one, it's really similar to this first one over here. These two angles are touching, so adjacent, and then 60 plus 30 adds up to 90. So these two angles would also be adjacent and complementary. So taking a look over here, if you notice these angles make an X, and they're not next to each other, they're the ones that are across from each other. So if this left one was 50, this right one would be 50 because these are vertical angles. And vertical angles will always be congruent, they'll balance each other out. And notice I just did the angle symbol for angles. Now, on this next one, I have 40 and 140. They're not touching, so they're not adjacent. 40 plus 140 will add up to 180. But they're not touching. They're not making a straight line. So they're not going to be a linear pair because they're not adjacent, but they are supplementary. Which leads us to the last one. Now, if you notice, these angles are in an X, but I'm not talking about the angles that are across from each other because these angles would be vertical angles. I'm talking about the ones that are next to each other. So I'm going to go ahead and trace these angles out. And if you notice, they share a side, which means that they are adjacent, but I'm also noticing something else. They're making a line. So they're adjacent and they're sitting on a line, which means that they'll add up to 180. So this right here is a linear pair. Anytime you have an X, the angles that are across from each other are going to balance each other out and be the same. So, like I said earlier, if one is 50, the other one will be 50. If one is 70, then the other one will be 70. If one is 100, then the other one will be 100. But if the angles are next to each other, and it doesn't matter which way you go, because they're sitting on the same line, the ones next to each other, they're on the same line, they're adjacent, they'll make a linear pair. So I could subtract from 180 because a linear pair is supplementary. So 180 minus 100 means that this angle would be 80 and this angle would be 80 because these are vertical and they would balance each other out. So if you know one angle in the set, you know all of them. So going back to over here, if this is 50 and this is 50, the ones next to each other make a linear pair and should add up to 100. So what's 180 minus 50? And if you said 130, you're right. So that one would be 130, and so would be the one across from it because those have to balance each other out. And all four would have to add up to 360. So let's take a look at solving some of these problems and going through and looking at our vocab. Now, we saw a picture just like this earlier, and we saw this box, meaning that anytime you see this box in here, that's 90 degrees. These are going to add up to 90, so these angles are adjacent, they're touching, and complementary. Now, complementary is what I want to focus on because complementary tells me how to solve this. If I go back and I look up here, complementary angles add up to 90, so part plus part equals 90. So all that I'm going to do is add these together and set it equal to 90. So x and x would make that 2x if I combine like terms. So 2x plus 25 equals 90. And then I'm going to set up my fence. I don't have variables on both sides to worry about, so from here I'm going to solve. So I'm going to subtract 25 on each side. So 2x would equal 65. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and if you need a calculator, that's totally fine. X would equal 32.5. That's it. So once you recognize what they are, that's going to tell you how to solve. So taking a look at this next one, I see two angles next to each other, so that means that they're adjacent. But I'm also noticing that they're sitting on a straight line. They're sitting on that line together. So they're adjacent, they're supplementary, which means that this right here is a linear pair. And if you go back and we look at linear pair, a linear pair was supplementary, and supplementary means part plus part equals 180. So if you have a linear pair, that's how I'm going to set this up. A linear pair will always just be part plus part equals 180, similar to how complementary was part plus part equals 90. So over here, if I combine like terms, if I do part plus part equals 180, I'm going to combine my x's. So 5x and 4x makes that 9x. 45 minus 18. I have 45. I pay 18 means I still have 27 equals 180. And then I'm going to set up my fence and I'm going to go ahead and solve. Notice I don't have variables on both sides, so I'm just trying to get x by itself. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 27. Which leaves me with 180 minus 27 is 153. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 9. So x is going to equal 17. Now, if the problem had wanted you to find each angle, that's where I would just take 17 and plug it back in and find out what's 5 times 17 minus 18. But this just said solve for x, solve for the unknown variable. So that's it. Now, taking a look at this next one, they're all sitting on a line together. But there's 3 angles, not 2. So while they are all sitting on a line together, it's not a linear pair because I don't have a pair. But they are sitting on a line, which means that they're going to add up to 180 because they're all supplementary. You can have a line, but because I don't have 2, that just means they're supplementary. And supplementary means that they're all going to add up to 180. Now, this one's a little bit more complicated than the other ones because supplementary, if we go take a look at our chart, supplementary was part plus part equals 180. But sometimes you have an added piece. So this isn't part plus part equals 180. This is part plus part plus part equals 180. So when I'm combining like terms, I have to add all the x's together and be really careful. So 5 plus 1 plus 3 makes that 9x. And then I have 7 positive of positive 4 minus 2. So that would be positive 9 equals 180. And then I'm going to set up my fence and solve from there. And notice that all of these solving ones are really similar. When I don't have a variable on the other side, I end up just adding or subtracting. In this case, subtract 9. 9x equals 171. Divide both sides by 9. So x is going to equal 19. So if you caught it, what did all of these above problems have in common? They only had a variable on one side because they were all part plus part. So anytime you have a part plus part equals whole problem, that means that you're going to combine like terms and you'll have a variable only on one side. So what we're going to get into now is what if they're not part plus part? So taking a look at this problem right here, these arcs mean that your angles are congruent. I'm going to use the symbol for congruent. Okay? It also means that this thing cut my angle in half. And maybe you remember that the word for cutting things in half was a bisector. Now, if you can't remember what congruent or bisector mean, go back and look at your vocabulary. Congruent mean that they had the same measure. Bisector cut it in half, which made them the same. And both of those things tell you that it's going to be part equals part now. So if this side is 80, that means that this other piece is also going to be 80. So to solve this, I would just do 2x part equals 80, the other part. And then from there, just divide both sides by 2, x would equal 40. And that's it. So figure out what they are, and then from there ask yourself, how do you set it up and how do you solve? Which leads me to this next one. I'm seeing an x, and they're across from each other, which tells me that they're vertical angles. Now, if you forget, go back and look. Vertical angles up here were across from each other. Vertical angles were congruent, meaning part equals part. So I'm going to go back down here, and I'm just going to set them equal to each other because vertical angles are part equals part. Now, whenever you're doing part equals part, sometimes you have variables on both sides. So you really want to take a look at your variables, and you want to pick the bigger variable to go first. So I don't want to say 2y plus 98 equals 9y plus 7. I want the bigger variable first. So I want to put this piece first, and that's just going to help me out whenever I'm solving, and I have to put my letter on the left. So I'm going to say 9y plus 7 equals 2y plus 98. And then I'm going to set up my fence and I'm going to solve. And a lot of times with part equals part, you're going to have variables on both sides. And so I always want to start on the right and put that variable on the left. So I'm going to subtract 2y from both sides. So 9 minus 2y would give you 7y plus 7 equals 98. And then from there, subtract 7. So 7y equals 98 minus 7 is 91. Divide both sides by 7. And so y is going to equal 17 or 13. Not 17, 13. That's it. Okay, now if I wanted you to find all of the angles, you would just take 13 and you would plug it back in. So I could do 2 times 13 plus 98, and I could type that into the calculator. And then I can also do 9 times 13 plus 7. And because it was part equals part, they should be the same thing. So I'm going to give you a minute to just pause the video real quick, type this into the calculator, and see what you get. And if you do it correctly, you should get 124 on both sides. Now, remember that vertical angles were across from each other, that they were part equals part, but the ones that are next to each other should add up to 180. So if you know that this is 124 and this is 124, find out what's 180 minus 124, and that's going to tell you what this angle next to them is. And if you do it correctly, you should get 56 on both sides. Which leads us to this next one. Now, I know that there are 3 variables here, but start out with something that you know. I know that this piece is 65. Hey, if that's 65, remember that the one across from it should balance it out, which means that this one on the other side should also be 65. Because vertical angles are congruent. So those are across from each other, vertical angles, which means that now I have to find x and z. So think back to the last one. If they were next to each other, what did we say they added up to? 180. So to find out what x or z is, I'm going to do 180 minus 65, which is 115. And then x and z are going to be the same thing, 115 and 115. Now, what did those problems have in common? Most of those problems were part equals part. So it changes how you solve it. So as you're going through all of these problems, make sure that you're asking yourself, is it part plus part or part equals part? And that you have this vocabulary list that you can take a look at to go back and double check what your angles are. Now, we'll do this last problem later, but make sure that you spend some time looking at that vocabulary and making sure that you know all of the angle relationships. We'll see you next time.